Hello again and welcome back to a brand new series and a brand new year here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. Yes, hello again and welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV and of course to the beginning of a brand new year here on my YouTube channel. Now we've got some nice bikes coming up for you at the start here of 2025, but of course the biggest event that we'll be attending early in the year will be the 2025 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, which will be coming up at the beginning of February this year, and of course you can see all of the bikes from that 2-day event here on my channel soon after. But until then, we're going to take a look at another nice looking vintage classic, and we're going to go back to the Terry Pickering classic motorcycle collection to take a look at this particular machine. So let's dive straight into our first posting of 2025 and take a look at Terry's 1973 MX360 Yamaha. Yes, welcome back to a brand new year and of course to a brand new series of Classic Dirt Bike TV. We're going to begin 2025 with a look at another superb classic from the Terry Pickering collection, and this time round it's the turn of Terry's 1973 MX360 Yamaha, which is a recent addition to Terry's Museum of Old Off-Road Classics. Now I'm pretty sure that by now you'll already know about Terry's background from when his dad owned and operated Stormer motorcycles in Ross and Wye in Herefordshire many years ago, but Terry's now retired from his day job and he spends most of his spare time collecting and restoring classic dirt bikes, which, as you can imagine, is a very valuable source of material for my YouTube channel. So I do try and make that annual pilgrimage of the 800-mile round trip to Terry's home each and every year to stock up on vintage dirt bikes to feed the many subscribers that take the time to look at my video content. Anyhow, the story behind this particular MX360 specimen is that this bike was originally brought into the UK by Terry's brother-in-law, whose daytime business is importing cars and other vehicles into the UK. But to cut a much longer story a bit shorter, Terry ended up buying this bike from his relation, and when Terry first clapped eyes on the bike, it was a pretty sorry looking sight, and basically it was just an old 1973 wreck. So Terry did what he does best, and he completely stripped the bike down to its last nut and bolt and did a full restoration on the sum of its parts. But to say that the bike was in a pretty rough state would be a massive understatement, but the good news was that the biggest percentage of this machine appeared to be all intact, but there were many parts that were either worn out, broken, or even needed replacing altogether. So it was going to be quite a long slog to get it all back to some kind of reasonable condition. But there were also quite a few parts missing from the bike, and Terry did eventually track down all the bits and pieces that he eventually required, but he did have to surf the internet and of course the entire globe to try and find bits that he needed, and he was ordering parts from places like the USA, Australia, and even all across Europe as well. So exactly what were these MX360s like to ride back in the early 1970s? Now, I personally wasn't lucky enough to be able to try one when they were launched in that year, so I can't really comment offhand just as to what they were like to ride, but they certainly had some serious competition, that's for sure, because it was about the same time that Honda had brought out that mighty 125 and 250 Elsinores, which, as you know, were mega popular during that period. So our 360 Yamaha was certainly going to have some serious competition if it was going to take on the might of the super sharp Honda Elsie. But let's just take a quick look around at some of the bits and pieces that go into building our MX 360. And just in case you haven't already noticed, you can see that our Yamaha here had quite a long wheelbase, and I think it was about 56 inches from wheel to wheel. And the bike's chassis was also a light gauge tubular steel frame that had a kind of double pair of front down tubes that then led onto a kind of cradle chassis that ran underneath the engine. But by all accounts, this 360 chassis was quite strong, even for a relatively small 360 two-stroker, and when it was pushed hard with a skilled rider giving it the message, reports of any flexing or twisting were virtually non-existent. So the chassis wasn't only reasonably light being made of steel, it was still strong as well. And in this shot here you can see the twin down tubes that run down from the headstock to eventually go underneath the engine to give you that double cradle chassis. And again here at the back of the 360's chassis, this steel swing arm was yet another quite robust piece of steel that could take any kind of punishment that the chassis came across on even the roughest of racetracks, which again this part stayed rock solid with absolutely no flexing whatsoever. But having said that, I do remember that some of the motorcycle testers of the day that tested these motorcycles to almost destruction when they were first unveiled to the world, they did comment about the actual weight of this swing arm, which they did find to be quite heavy for a bike of this size, and it would have been well at home, maybe even on a bigger open class 500. And because this rear swing arm was quite heavy and made of steel, was one of the reasons that owners who raced these Yamahas back in the 1970s ended up removing these steel swing arms in favour of a much lighter alloy part. But of course, the downside of swapping this steel part for a softer alloy one is that the lighter alloy swingers couldn't take the same kind of punishment as the original steel ones, and things like cracks and breakages were quite common. But overall, the bike's frame and its swing arm in its original steel state was quite well designed and robust in about every department. So the skeleton side of this motorcycle received full marks from the people who raced them back in the 1970s. Now, exactly why you would want to fit a side stand onto an off-road dirt bike, I don't know, but Yamaha appeared to do just that back in 1973, but for what reason, I haven't a clue. But maybe they thought that you'd maybe want to nip down to the shops in the middle of a race and you needed a side stand to park the bike up, but it's still quite rare to see one of these stock side stands still fitted onto one of these MX360s, because this part here was usually one of the first things that a rider would remove from the bike, as it served no practical purpose whatsoever, and it just added extra weight onto the all-up volume of the complete motorcycle. And also in 1973, these are the self-same stock standard footrests that you'd find on these MX360s, which you can see are quite narrow and probably wouldn't offer much support for the rider's scrambles boots. But of course, in our modern day now, you can retrofit some nice quality super wide alloy foot pegs that can be turned out on a computerized CNC milling machine in just a matter of hours. Although this is not so much of a criticism of these skinny steel items. This is just what you had to work with back in the 1970s. Anyhow, moving on to the MX360's engine, which was an absolute belter of a power plant, even for 1973. And basically, this was a 360 two-stroke with a reed valve induction system that also had a separate oil lubrication system to feed all of the important parts of the motor with their oil. But let's just first take a look at that Yamaha's engine oil lubrication system, whereby the oil and of course the fuel were two separate systems. So there was no need to mix the oil and petrol before adding it into the fuel tank. So behind this side panel here, you had a small plastic oil tank that held, I think it was about 1.5 pints of lubrication two-stroke oil, and that lubrication fluid was then fed into a very small oil pump that was driven from the crankshaft, and through a series of flexible pipes, oil was then injected to all of the important parts of the engine. Now, although this system did work well enough, you still had all of that extra weight of oil, tank, pump and hoses, etc. And it was very common for riders just to remove all of that paraphernalia and then simply blank off the pump drive and then just go back to mixing the oil and fuel in the traditional two-stroke fashion, which is exactly what's happened here on our 360. But there was one other quite unique part that was fitted onto these 360s back in 1973, and it was a thing called an omni-phase balancer shaft, which was basically a chain-driven eccentric weight that rotated in the opposite direction of the crank's rotation, which was supposed to produce some kind of negative oscillation wave to counteract any bad vibrations that the crank produced to make the engine run super smooth at higher RPM. But that balancer shaft was located here just below the reed valve intake for the engine's carburetor. And I do remember that these 360s also had this Yamaha innovation in that it had an automatic decompressor to make the engine that bit easier to kick over and start. So again, this auto decompressor was linked to the kickstart by a cam connecting cable, and when you push down on the kicker, the valve would open, slightly lowering the compression, which they say did work very well, and it made starting this 360 just about as easy as kicking over a 250. But to supply the fuel into our two-stroke Yamaha engine, it was usually a VM34 SC Mikuni carburetor that had the job of mixing the fuel and the air, and it appears that that's what's exactly bolted on to our Terry Pickering motor here. Now, that Mikuni carburetor got its air supply through a wet oil foamed filter that was inside the bike's plastic airbox, and eventually that fuel and air mixture would be fed into the engine through a 6-pedal reed valve block. And to connect that Mikuni carburetor to both the reed valve intake and the air filter box, it was just a couple of rubber boots or hoses that kept any unwanted particles of dirt and moisture from entering the inner workings of this engine. So as we move on to the sparks, or the ignition side of our 360 engine, now behind this cover we had a relatively modern style CDI ignition system, or capacitor discharge ignition, if you want to give it its proper title. But again, this was still quite high tech for 1973, because some motorcycles were still using the old school points and condenser ignitions at this time. But this system here was usually super reliable, and once you got it all set up correctly, it was virtually maintenance free as well. And here on the clutch end of our MX, it was an oil-cooled wet multi-plate unit that consisted of a series of wet cork-driven plates and steel separator plates. And the clutch basket was driven straight off the crankshaft by way of a simple connecting gear. So there was no stupid things in this engine like primary change to worry about on this Yamaha engine. And once again, at the business end of the engine's transmission, it was a 5-speed gearbox, which, as I remember, I think it was you clicked the shifter down for first gear and then up for all subsequent gears thereafter. But 5 cogs was usually more than enough to keep our 360 flying along and keep you at the sharp end of the racing pack. But they do say as long as you kept this 360 engine in its mid-range where it did all of its best work, and coupled with this 5-speed transmission, there wasn't really many bikes that would pass you on the track. But you can see that our 360 still appears to have many of its stock original parts, and this exhaust expansion chamber certainly still looks as good as it did back in 1973. But then again, I suppose this part here could have had work done on it, or even been replaced when the bike went through its restoration process by Terry. But either way, there's not a ding, dent or abrasion on this pipe, so who knows, this may even be a brand new old stock part, because as I said, original bits and pieces can still be found for these MXs, but usually these parts come from the USA, where these bikes were massively popular back in the 1970s. And although the motor's expansion chamber appears original and intact, here at the tailpipe it seems that the tail cone or the silencer is missing from this exhaust. Now, whether Terry has it in his workshop and he just forgot to fit it, I don't actually know. And I suppose it could even have come from the USA without this part, but it would have been just a mild steel kind of tail cone, about 6 to 8 inches in length, that would have been connected on to this piece of pipe. Although there is a flip side to this missing silencer, and it's simply that riders just decided to remove the silencer because it just added extra weight onto the bike. And as long as the race organisers didn't have any restrictions with regards to decibel levels from these exhausts, then the riders would just make do with the crackle from this open tailpiece. But I have to say that overall, this 360 two-stroke Yamaha engine was certainly a belter of a motocross motor, and it was said, I think, to pump out around the 40 or so horsepower, which it was pretty decent for an engine of this size, but it did have very little in the way of vices, and all of its components did work very well in racing trim. And as long as you kept this motor buzzing and in the mid-range, then this engine would do exactly what it said on the tin. So as we trek our way across to the front of our MX360, and we take a gander here at the bike's front forks, which were a pretty simple, straightforward kind of designed, and again they did work very well as long as the tracks never had too many bumps or jumps, because these Yamaha forks were exactly what you'd expect for 1973, with none or very little scope for tuning them for rebound or compression. But having said that, you could certainly still experiment with different spring rates or lighter or heavier fork oil to try and make them harder or softer. But it's not because Yamaha didn't want to have adjustable forks on this models. It's just that most off-roaders in this period were of much the same design, and as I've said many times in the past, these kind of forks and the suspension technology was what you had to make do with in that period. Also here at the front end we had your Yamaha hub and front brake, which they do say was another one of the plus points on these 73 Yamahas, because this front hub and brake certainly did a very good job of slowing or stopping our 360 when it was in full flight. But it was a simple drum and shoe type arrangement, and not like, of course, the high-tech hydraulic brakes that we enjoy today, but just a simple cable operated braking system that acted onto the outside of that rotating drum. And here at the back brake, it was another kind of vintage drum and shoe arrangement, which I do remember the bike testers in the motocross magazines of that day commenting on just how sharp this back brake was. And in fact, some even said that it was too sharp, because it seemed to be that the slightest touch on that rear brake pedal would cause this rear brake to lock up. And if you take a look at that little brass button there just above the wheel spindle, you can see that this rear hub and axle still had a grease nipple fitted to it, which is something that you'd never see now on a modern day off-roader. So next up, it's the rear shocks on our Terry Pickering Yamaha, and back in 1973 it probably would have been just a pretty basic pair of dampers that would have been fitted to the back of this bike, which to be fair were not unlike these ones that are bolted on to our example, which again had virtually no means of adjusting the compression or rebound, although you certainly could compress or soften the external springs by simply turning this adjuster clicker here at the bottom of the shock. But after having a second look at these shocks, they certainly do look identical to the 1973 originals, because those old original shocks had this gas and oil reservoir here to hold those two materials for the suspension damping. But as to whether you could actually dismantle or rebuild these shocks and gas reservoir, I don't actually know, but by all accounts, the back end of our Yamaha still did okay with the technology that was available at the time. And as with the front end of the bike, as long as the track wasn't too rough or bumpy, it would usually cope well enough. Now here on the MX360's fuel tank, I'm pretty sure that this was still being made of steel back in '73, and I think it just held short of the 2.5 gallons of petrol. Not pre-mixed oil and petrol, of course, because in 1973 our 360 engine still had its own oil injection lubrication system, so there was no need to premix the fuel and the two-stroke oil before you added it into this tank, unless of course that you've already removed that oil injection pump and storage tank, whereby you'd then have to mix the oil and petrol together before pouring it into this tank. But I suspect that this fuel cell here has more than likely undergone a full strip down and repaint when the rest of the bike was refurbished, because as you can see it's in almost better than brand new condition. So whether it was Terry or whoever else did this painting on this tank, they've done an absolutely fantastic job, because they appear to have got the colour and the Yamaha graphics absolutely spot on. Now, with the minimum amount of movement that you had at the back end of these MX360s, it was quite important that you at least had a decent seat to try and help your backside cope with all of the bumps and other oscillations that the rear suspension had to cope with. And having just a few inches of up and down movement on the shocks, then this seat had thankfully a decent amount of padding with its foam insert and fiberglass seat base. But as with the rest of this bike, this part again has undergone a full refurb with, at the very least, what appears to be a replacement seat cover. And again, this seat was held onto the bike chassis by just two small bolts here at the rear and a single bolt at the front, just behind the rear of the bike's fuel tank. So as we move on to the bodywork on our Terry Pickering bike, which as you can see is again in immaculate condition after their recent freshen up. But whether parts like these side panels are actually 1973 originals, I'm not entirely sure, although you can still certainly locate reproduction panels for these 360s if you shop around the interweb. But if my aging memory is still functioning as it should, the bodywork side panels on these MXs I think were made from plastic back then, which was quite rare for the early 1970s, because many European off-roaders were still using fiberglass at this time. But to hold those parts onto the chassis, both of the side panels were attached using these fasteners that I remember I think were called something like Zeus fasteners, and they had one on either panel. But moving swiftly on to the front and the rear mudguards, which again, as far as I know, were made from more durable plastic, and as per the side panels, these would have been painted with some nice fresh paint when the bike was being restored. But it's all been properly done, as you can see, and professionally painted. And these plastic mudders would have been much more durable than maybe fiberglass or alloy parts, which, as you know, were what was used on many of those older off-road bikes of the late 1950s and early 60s. So as you can imagine, these plastic items were certainly a lot more rugged, and they could take quite a bit of punishment on the track, unlike those earlier fiberglass items that, although those were super light, they were very brittle as well and broke easily, and not to mention they weren't that easy to repair either. But all of the plastics on our 360 have now all been brought back to their original 1973 condition. But finally, moving up onto the business end of our Yamaha Classic, which looks like it still has its 1973 handlebars, which is another rare part to still find bolted onto one of these Japanese bikes. And again, more than likely that these bars have all been re-chromed, or who knows, these could even be a pair of new old stock items because they're in such good condition. And usually the telltale sign of having a proper pair of original 1973 bars bolted onto your 360 is that this crossbar is nearly always welded onto both sides rather than by maybe a pair of clamps that you often find on, say, a modern pair of rental bars. So without question, these certainly look like the real McCoy. Now, some of the other controls, like this clutch lever, as far as I know, are certainly the correct period items for the bike, although naturally these may not be the stock 73 originals, but the grips and the levers are about as near as you're ever going to get to stock 360 parts. But I've also just noticed that Terry's added a decompressor lever here just underneath the clutch lever, which I suspect will be a kind of manual override just in case that automatic decompressor system fails to work. And also on this clutch lever side, Terry's fitted an engine kill switch as well, just in case of any problems with the Yamaha's 360 engine and it needs to be shut down in a hurry. Although I'm not entirely sure that this part was fitted in 1973, but it's certainly a valuable asset to protect that Yamaha motor from any kind of damage. So this Throttle Gaser here twist grip is the part that has the job of keeping those 39 or 40 horses that the 360 engine is said to put out to keep them in check. So you need a steady hand here on this twist grip when our 73 Yamaha starts to fly. But almost certainly this gasser here isn't the stock standard part from when the bike was brand new, but it's still performing exactly the same job as the factory item from Japan. But as I mentioned to you at the start of this video, now this bike, as I said, came from the USA courtesy of Terry's brother-in-law, who imports cars and other vehicles into the UK. And when Terry originally purchased his bike, it was in a pretty dire state, and Terry had to do a complete resto on the bike, and he trotted the globe trying to find all of the parts that he needed to complete its restoration. But Terry did tell me that this MX360 was possibly one of the best bikes that he's ever restored, and that's not because of its rarity or its eventual looks. He said it was because it was such a pleasure to work on, and not only did it come apart easily when it came to the actual rebuild and the refitting of brand new parts to the bike, Terry just couldn't believe how easily and how well everything went together, and every hole, screw, bolt and component just seemed to line up exactly, and you didn't have to lever or maybe drill a part to make it fit. He says everything more or less fell right into place, and he said it was an absolute pleasure to work on this bike. And so, as you can see, after all of Terry's very hard work, it looks like he's now got himself another classic to add to his already substantial collection of vintage and classic off-roaders. And I, for one, am already looking forward to my next visit to Pickering Towers to take a look at more of his motorcycle gems that he's added to his vast assortment of off-road racing history. Right, so coming up next on CDB TV, we've got something for all of the Suzuki riders that watch my channel. So next up, we're going to take a look at this 1981 RM 250 Suzuki, which is another nice classic to showcase early on in 2025. So do make sure that you return to take a look at this very nice example. But in the meantime, thanks once again for taking the time to watch my video content. So until our next classic motorcycle encounter, it's cheerio for now.